about the parallels of industrialization in, say, Britain or even America. And listening to what you were saying, I'm not sure, certainly the speed is faster, but if you look at industrialisation in Britain from the 1780s to the 1840s, and the drawing in of rural workers into the mills and factories, you will see very similar types of labour discipline, types of you don't have to read the child slavery reports from Parliament into the way they treat children. So I think you can actually see that this is not specific to Soviet Russia in terms of drawing in peasants into the labour force. And I did wonder about, because you said that they developed the division of labour largely to atomise the workforce, whereas wasn't it in fact related as well to Taylorism and Fordism, that you have to break down the tasks precisely because you've got largely untrained peasants coming in, or in the case of America, rural workers, and therefore you have to break down the tasks to make the training less complicated, and that's a very important part. And again, if you look at, and I'm not trying to be an apologist for the Stalinist system, but if you look at Ford's factories in the early period, the discipline and the goons and the attacks on the labour force were very similar to making sure that labour force was disciplined and kept in line.
All those points are correct, and the parallels are important. So, to a certain extent, the Soviet Union was replicating the same processes that existed in capitalist accumulation, capitalist industrialization. There was also there was the problem of acculturating a new workforce to industrial discipline, timekeeping, obeying orders. But there are important differences in the way the system evolved. You mentioned the Soviets were fascinated by Ford and Taylor. But in fact, if you looked at the way the Soviet system operated, it was pre-Taylorist. And the reason is, if you read Taylor, everything in Taylor depends upon integration. So the actual worker is dehumanized. He's just a cog in the wheel. But the whole Stalinist system actually broke down coordination between units because the emphasis was on always overproducing a target, overproducing a plan. Well, you can think of many simple examples here. So production processes are integrated. Suppose you're in a machine building factory and somebody's producing part X, so part Y, part Z, etc. Right? And the guys producing part X are shop workers, and they overproduce. But the guys producing parts Y and Z are just producing according to the target. What do you do with the excess production that the guys in X produced? You don't do anything with it. It's just there. It sits in a warehouse. And when you reproduce this logic on a mass scale over thousands and thousands of factories, all coordination breaks down. And this was a chronic situation. The other side of this, which made it worse, of course, was the fact that the targets they were trying to make that the state was trying to get the system as a whole to meet were unrealistic. In other words, they didn't have the resources, and so everybody was choked by shortages. So you had, especially in the first few years, you had the shells of factories put up, but there was no machinery for them. You had factories produced and stocked with machinery, but no one put in an electricity supply. You had construction sites that had plenty of timber, plenty of cement. No one delivered any bricks. And the whole system was like this. The Mensheviks in exile described this beautifully, but they didn't understand. They thought it was going to lead to the collapse of the system. What they didn't understand is that if you wait long enough, the bricks will show up. And that it may take many, many years, but eventually the factories will get finished and they will start churning out production. But the problem was, the problem of shortages and bottlenecks was never solved. The Soviets had a word for it, storming. And what storming meant was that for large parts of the month, you sat around just doing a minimal amount of work. because you didn't have any supplies, and then everything shows up in the last 10 days, and then you have to bust a gut. You have to bust a gut in order to get it all done on time. And storming was an invention of Stalinism. And it existed, it never stopped. You had storming in 1991 as the Soviet Union was collapsing, because they never found a way to coordinate. And then there are many reasons for this, but one of which is they never had control over the labor process. But basically, in terms of answering your question, the system gave lip service to things like Taylor, but it was pre-Taylorist.
Very good.
Yeah, just before I make my comment, I'd just like to say something to what you just said, which is simply what you're describing is a system that had no plan, no organisation, and in fact calling it the 5-year plan was the exact opposite of what it was. But the comment I was going to make with a question at the end is you've described absolute horror. I mean, there's no other way of looking at it. But at the same time as all this is going on in industry, you've got the political terror going on. And in a sense, you wonder why that was going on, because by the time of the 5-year plan, by 1929, the left, in terms of the anti-Stalinist left, the people who had opposed Stalin, were defeated, destroyed, either in exile or more and more going into the camps and then the isolators and whatever. And in fact, most of the terror takes place on Stalin's apparatchiks themselves, the people who'd supported him, the managers of these factories who weren't fulfilling their targets and whatever. Why do you see a relationship between that political terror and the conditions of workers at the base, and the peasants, obviously? What's the relation between the two? I mean, these people were people who were loyal to Stalin, who were murdered. Why did he do it? And does it have a relationship to the situation in industry?
I'm just going to see if we've got any more questions just before.
Okay. The only reason I was answering one at a time, so I don't forget.
Do you want the paper and a pen? Or?
Yes.
Yes? Has anybody got some paper? I've written all this down while you were talking, so I haven't got any left anyway. Man in the red t-shirt and then the man in the blue shirt. Has anyone got enough paper?
I'll put it on scribble on the margin.
Thank you.
Okay. My question is, when you showed the first two graphs showing the massive increase in the industrial working class, the graph showed, and you commented on the fact that it was significant that women workers increased even more than male workers and continued to increase. You said it was significant, but you didn't say anything after that.
Because I was waiting for your question.
There was the question. What is the significance, particularly, were there different ways that women resisted, were the pressures different, etc.?
Some of the strikes were led by women, for obvious reasons, because they were food strikes. But no, from the point of view of the political economy, it was important, because the way the wage system was set up, there was the standard of living collapsed, real wages plummeted. So, in a situation of labor shortage, this was a way of compelling women to join the workforce. If you looked at the way unemployment ended, there was mass unemployment in the USSR, perhaps surprisingly, at the end of NEP. And the first huge growth in the workforce comes from dependents in the urban sector joining the industrial workforce. After that, it has to come almost exclusively from peasants, and from women moving from other sectors into industry. Now, the way the system was set up, therefore, was that in order for a household to compensate for the collapse in real wages, you needed to have at least two, preferably more, wage earners. So you've got all these women flooding into production, but family incomes are not doubling. They're only going up a tiny bit to get up to survival threshold. So as Wendy Goldman points out in her book, Women at the Gates, which is a study of women workers, basically the state was getting all this extra female labor almost for free. It was a barometer of the super exploitation of all workers, but of women in particular. So that was that was what I had in mind in terms of its in terms of its significance. Now, it also established certain patterns of female labor, which were to exist all through the Soviet period. Women, on the one hand, entered professions and trades that they didn't enter in other countries, and which they hadn't entered prior to industrialization. And to that extent, it looked like they were achieving a certain degree of parity with men. But if you look closer, you see that women were subjected to both horizontal and vertical segregation. In other words, within the factories, or even within a particular trade, they were at the bottom and had lower chances of promotion compared to men. They also were marginalized into what became overwhelmingly female industries. Textiles was not an overwhelmingly female industry until industrialization. Then it became almost exclusively female. So women have become concentrated into, highly concentrated in textiles, garment, food, chemicals, etc. Where the wages are lower, are considerably lower than wages of male-dominated industries. The other thing that emerges is that, and this is quite atypical of Western society, is that women take on a disproportionate amount of heavy manual, unskilled labor. So the pattern in Soviet industry, particularly after the war, is that when a job becomes mechanized, men are taken off manual jobs and given the mechanized jobs as a privilege. Women are then brought in to do the heavy manual labor and are trapped at the bottom. And that's something that is uniquely Soviet from that point of view. So these patterns are already set during the industrialization period.
One in the blue shirt? Yeah.
First of all, a comment. I thought that was an interesting point about sort of production norms and lack of coordination. In fact, it reminds me of something that a senior manager once said in a company I used to work for. It said, if somebody overfulfills their objectives by 100%, of course they're a hero, but they're wasting the company's resources and they're messing up the company plans, so they don't actually want people to do that. Anyway, but on to my main question, is basically essentially, I've recently read stuff about the Great Leap Forward in China, which was essentially an attempt to do what Stalin did in Russia, but in an even more ideologically crazy way and even more murderous and repressive way. But the point about the Great Leap Forward is it basically failed, right? Now the question is, could Stalinist industrialization have failed? Because ultimately it was successful. Ultimately it did turn Russia into an industrial power. But could it have just gone completely wrong and just completely collapsed?
Okay, any questions about
housing, food supply, but I was wondering how the 5-year plans affected children. Like, for example, did children have to even work, or just like general facts in that?
One thing I noticed when I was reading through material published in Britain in the 1930s about the Soviet Union was a real cleavage between those who just saw the official Soviet propaganda and those who could actually read the Soviet press. And the difference was dramatic, where one was all just glowing reports of the wonders of Soviet socialism, but the other people, a wide variety of political viewpoints, were saying, well, actually it's chaotic. And the problems are caused by storming the planned targets, exceeding planned targets, the disruption and the lack of coordination between different parts of industry was all very well known because it was all in the Soviet press, in the Soviet technical journals. It was there for you to read. And if you compiled the information, you got this basic idea of poor workmanship, poor storekeeping, total chaos in communications, very poor quality work, and a whole list of things. Now, of course, at that point, you wasn't sure whether it was teething problems or whether it was endemic. We now know it was endemic. But these problems were known at the time in the West. But one thing that various people said was, well, yes, it is chaotic, it is barbaric, but could this be done on any other way? Could this method of modernisation at such a vast scale be done in a market economy? And these people who are not left-wingers by any means were saying, well, no, actually, it couldn't be done. And that raises an interesting question of the two places where you've had this form of non-market modernisation, where primary accumulation has been done on a non-market basis, that is, Soviet Union and China, are the last two large countries, big backward countries, which have actually had an industrial revolution of any size. Other countries which have industrialised since really the beginning of the 20th century have either been fairly small, like South Korea, or fairly marginal. What does this mean for the industrial revolutions in third world countries? Is that possible in a market economy? And if you haven't got the political prerequisites, that is a sort of a Stalinist party that's willing to brush aside all opposition and mobilise in a forceful way society's resources, is any form of industrial revolution possible now in these countries?
Do you want to come back on those, Don, and then we'll take another round?
Right. These are toughies. Terror. Who asked about terror? All right. That's a really complicated question. First of all, there's a certain chronological sort of disjuncture here in the way you presented the question, in the sense that the terror really starts 1936, 37, 38. By then, industry has settled down considerably. Even labor turnover is dropped to levels of 100%. So the average worker only changes a job once a year instead of 3 times a year. And living standards are getting a little bit better. Rationing is ended. They made this catastrophic mistake of introducing Stakhanovism, which disrupts everything again, all over again. Then we have this assault, as you correctly say, on the apparatus and on the new generation of managers. That's a complicated question, and there's lots of different theories, many of which have degrees of plausibility without themselves being totally plausible. So one aspect is that Stalin is desperate to rein in the provincial party leaders and economic managers who are clearly violating plan instructions, some of which I've described, but they're doing it in other ways as well, in terms of relations between one factory and another, between one commissariat, one industry and another, etc. That's possibly a partial thing. One is, of course, fear of opponents. The first wave of people who are destroyed were not party apparatus people, they were oppositionists. And then, of course, in 1937, you have the terror shifts ground dramatically. It shifts terrain dramatically, and that is you have what are known as the mass operations. And these were targeted at mainly people either in exile or formerly in exile, ex-kulaks, again, ex-oppositionists, people who possibly could have become a fifth column in the event of a war. And the mass operations are dictated from the center. They look like they're, check that, I'll come back to that in a second. They're dictated from the center. The provincial secret police, the NKVD, are given monthly targets for how many enemies of the people you have to uproot, what percentage of these unmasked, what percentage of these you have to shoot, etc. And of course, given this being the nature of Stalinist planning, everyone wants to overfulfill their plan. So the NKVD start finding even more enemies of the people than they were targeted, were assigned to do. And this was a tightly controlled process. It's masked by the fact that the other side of the purges and the terror was, when it first unleashed in late 36 and early 37, is that everywhere, everyone's been told to be vigilant, to look for an enemy of the people, to it's a bit like epidemiology. In fact, that's the best model you can use. Someone falls under suspicion. You then, all right, so that's the center. You then have to, like a good epidemiologist, you have to then track down the loyalty of all their contacts. Were any of them enemies of the people? You then identify those people, you arrest them, and then you interrogate them, and then you have to identify their contacts. It's exactly the same way that you would deal with an outbreak of tuberculosis or any virulent epidemic disease. And then people become hysterical in the sense that, well, the best way to show that you're not an enemy of the people is to denounce other people as enemies of the people. That proves your loyalty. And people lose trust with one another. Again, Wendy Goldman's written a wonderful book examining this, at the internal dynamics, by looking at what happened to party cells in a number of Moscow factories. But in fact, that is an important social phenomenon, but it doesn't account for the number of victims. It's the mass operations in 1937 that really chalk up the executions and the people who went to the Gulag. So you really have two different phases of the terror. Workers were basically immune from this. Very few, almost no industrial workers were. Rank and file industrial workers were touched by the terror. What they thought about it, I don't really know, and I don't think anyone else has really uncovered. There was another wave of terror after the war, and workers were involved in that, but to a lower scale, to a lesser extent. But I think it's hard to see an immediate parallel or immediate connection between what's going on, other than the fact, and this is very important, is that the atmosphere, even though the victims were not workers, everybody is terrorized. So the terror, when seen at a society level, disciplines all of society, even if you're not the one who's going to be arrested and sent to the Gulag. So it is a way of crushing, in its own way, it's a way of crushing any residual discontent. Could industrialization have failed? Could have, I don't know. I mean, counterfactual history is very difficult. I think in a way that's related to Paul's question about, basically you're asking, was Stalinism necessary, essential to industrialize essentially a third world country? Hard to say. The reason I used to think no when I was more convinced, when I was younger and thought I would still live to see a revolution and might live to see socialism or something in my lifetime. I used to think, yes, if the good guys had won, then they might have done it differently. I still think that's true, but whether it would have succeeded or not, we don't know. One would like to think so, but counterfactual history is totally impossible to prove. You raise a more interesting point when you talk about the contemporary world, I think, because the opportunities for poor countries to industrialize autonomously or autarkically are almost non-existent now. And that tells us more about contemporary capitalism than it does about the so-called Stalinist model. What I would say is this, and I think this is more relevant, I can say with some certainty. Stalinism industrialized the country, but it did it in a certain way that the system, from its very inception, bore within it the seeds of its own decline. In other words, the system was extremely dynamic so long as it had huge human and material resources that it could organize and could draw upon to build some kind of industrial base. Compensated for by a very large slave labor sector. In other words, workers were basically, up until 1940, workers were pretty much free to do what they wanted. So you had these large areas of production or geographical areas of the country where you couldn't persuade workers to go. And so they sent slaves to do that instead, through the Gulag. And the terror also helped. The first wave, of course, was collectivization, when sending millions of alleged kulaks to slave labor camps. And then their ranks were replenished through the terror, 1937, 1938. So you've got this dynamic phase of the system. But the point was that the basic, if you look within the way the system operated, it was so inefficient that it was hard to sustain this over the long run. It was unstable. And it was already in serious decline under Brezhnev, and then of course along came Gorbachev and pop goes, and then it just collapses altogether. But the seeds of its decline are already there, I think, in the way that industrialization was carried out. And that was basically due to the political structure of the society. Yeah? Children. What did you have in mind when you asked the question? That will determine the answer I give you.
I guess in terms of whether they even worked themselves to kind of add money to the family income, or how they were affected in terms of food supply and housing, where were they placed, if they were placed with their families, who came from the countryside to the cities to work. That's what I generally wanted to know.
The system, this is a really interesting question. I'm not an expert on children, but I know something about it. The system, in one level, looked after its children because they're the future. Children stayed with their families unless they were, but there were also a lot of orphans and homeless waifs who were dealt with very severely beginning in the end of the 1920s. People who were rootless, who literally were orphans, who had run away from home, they were seen as a public order problem, and they were put in detention centers, in detention camps. But by and large, the system, at least on the surface, invested heavily in its children. But there was also a fundamental change in the way that education was carried out in the 1930s. Before, in the 1920s, the Soviets had placed a lot of emphasis on what they called polytechnical education. In other words, people went to school, they went into higher education, and they were to learn not just basic skills in the humanities, but also technical skills. They were taught things like the basics of basic elements of planning, things that they were encouraged to think for themselves. When Stalin consolidated his rule and under industrialization, the curriculum changed dramatically towards rote learning and discipline, precisely to discourage people from learning how to think for themselves. Even if you talk to Russians today, people in their, say, 30s or 40s, if they're honest, they will tell you the big failure of their educational system was that they were never taught how to think. They were taught how to repeat and how to memorize, but they were never taught how to think creatively, to think for themselves. But in terms of, as I say, physical provision, during the war, the regime went to, when people were starving to death, literally hundreds of thousands, the regime went to great lengths to try to minimize the strain on its children. Most people left school at age 14 or 15, and you took a job. And that then became more or less compulsory during the war years, where you had to join there was a draft into vocational training schools, and you worked as an indentured laborer effectively for many years after that. But yes, people stayed with their families. There was always, in the 1930s during the terror, there was a political sort of schizophrenia that was introduced into families, in the sense that children were encouraged to be loyal to the state more than they were to their parents. So children were expected to denounce their parents if parents uttered anti-Soviet views. How many children actually did so, I think, is a different issue. So those are elements of things that you might want to look at. There's some quite good things published about children. There's a wonderful book by Katriona Kelly on Soviet childhood, which covers the entire Soviet period. It's encyclopedic. It would take you about a year to read it. It's about 1,000 pages long, I think. But you'll certainly know an awful lot about children when you finish.
Next round, I think there's the man at the back, and then here.
Kind of comment related to a question. It seems to me that this industrialisation didn't work, and related to that, what Soviet goods flooded into the West when the wall came down, trying to get hold of these goods. As far as I know, the economy is still dependent on raw materials. I don't know any products. I think now viruses, I think we've got, and various ransomware products that have come from there. In terms of industrialisation, Japan, at one point was the second largest economy in the world, and industrialised under a market system. Its problem now is it's so successful that it reached a impasse, and its growth is slow. A question about this is, if you agree with me that this industrialisation didn't work, and it seems to me obvious that it didn't, but you might disagree with me, why not? What's the principle here? Was it just they couldn't come up with the right form of control? Or was there something actually endemic? I mean, you said it was about a political structure, but could they not change that? This has been going on for, what, 50 years, or 60 years there in China? I don't know. It just went on and on and on. And when it finally went, to everybody's shock, the actual production was worked out to be 10% of given figures. I mean, that's according to the CIA, when they finally looked at 10% of actual figures of production.
Okay.
It follows on from the questions people have asked about the situation of women and children. I think it's Wendy Goldman who talks about how when the first five-year plan is imposed, some of the things which have been got rid of at the start of the NEP, like workplace nurseries, come back. And so some people think, aha, this is great because we're going back to the kind of, the kind of advance towards socialism that we were forced to abandon. And so and presumably, I mean, I don't know to what extent, they quickly realised that wasn't the case, or to what extent that was kind of taken by the regime and used. And I was just wondering what arguments, how did the regime justify the process? Because it seems clearly a repressive process which had very few gains for anybody, except maybe the...
Which process are we talking about?
Well, how did they justify the kind of imposition of norms and quotas and the speed up of work and so on that you've talked about? Because it seems clearly repressive. The only people that seem to get anything out of it are the layer of technical specialists you talked about near the top, that were like the bourgeoisie. So what ideological claims did they put forward to justify the whole thing? Well,
but also with regards to the situation of women, so you mentioned that they have more job opportunities, even though it probably wasn't that great, the job opportunities. It was probably still slightly more advanced than the rest of the Western society, and also in other areas, like I can't remember exactly, but there was some advances in women's rights early on in Soviet, in Bolshevik and Soviet rule, which were way ahead of their time in sort of other Western parts of Europe. And I was just wondering to what extent was women's position sort of increased and elevated, or is it sort of like a facade of them being elevated rather than there being a real change in the perception of women and sort of a decrease in, say, like misogyny in that sort of area of society, just sort of society's view of women? Okay, do you want to put those questions down in the ground?
gentleman at the back, it didn't fail. It did fail and it didn't fail, but you have to use a little bit of a dialectic here. It didn't fail in the sense that it became an industrial power. It produced a lot of defective goods, which then were used to produce a lot more defective goods. But it limped along. It kept the society going. It allowed it survived for what? Yeah, 60s. It didn't take a lot to put a Sputnik up. Come on. It's like, you know, you just put a radio in a ball and you put the ball on a very powerful rocket and you launch it into space. It's only got to go 26 miles up. And it scared the hell out of everybody. The transmitter. The thing is, the system managed to limp along for what is it, 7 decades or so. And so you're right and you're not right. So in the fact that it did survive. But what I tried to say earlier was that the almost inevitability of its collapse was there from the very beginning. Not from the very beginning, but certainly from Stalinist industrialization onwards, because it was a non-viable way to grow an economy and to keep an economy going. Basically, ultimately it's a political issue because the system did not have the toleration or support of the mass of the people who were actually doing the actual work. And that became unsustainable. It's a long discussion, but if you think in terms of sort of think of a society's growth would be a surplus product. You produce more than you produced the year before, you invest some of it, you increase consumption a little bit, and you grow a little more. This became increasingly difficult because so much of what they produced couldn't be used for what it was supposed to be used for. The steel ingots were too heavy, they were too brittle, the buildings fell down a little too quickly. As I've said, the rails wore out a little too fast. And then you've got this crazy system of arbitrary targets. So, you know, if you get a glass factory, and these are all real examples I'm going to give you, you've got a glass factory that has its plan is set in square meters of glass. How do you fulfill your quota when you're under stress? You produce really thin glass. You put it into new buildings, you put it into new blocks of flats, and you find the windows have all been knocked out before anyone's moved in. So you've got to produce the same amount again. So you need twice as many glass factories. The same with drinking glasses. Again, these are real examples from the Soviet press. Drinking glasses were so thin, you held them in your hand and they cracked. Because the glass factory had to meet its plan. And so they produced really thin glass. And the whole system worked like this. You know, the first time I went to the Soviet Union, I had a pair of heels wear out on some shoes. I got them replaced. The heels wore out in 2 weeks. I had to go back and get them replaced. Well, think about that. You got a shoe factory, right, that if a normal set of heels will last you, say, a year, and these are lasting every 2 weeks, you need 26 times the output of heels for shoes that you would in a Western factory. So you've got to build 26 times the production capacity. That means 26 times the amount of bricks and cement, machinery, fuel to keep the factories running, electric energy. This is a system that's self-consuming growth. It's fed on itself. And so it can never meet the demands of its population. So in that sense, yes, it was doomed to fail. Yeah. How did they justify it? Well, like your neighbor said, basically we're building socialism. And then you've got when you get in deep into the 1930s, it's almost an affront. People are being told how prosperous they are. And people know that they're suffering. We built socialism, comrades. Life is becoming more joyous, comrades, Stalin said. I can't remember, 1935 or 1936. And then, you know, and this caused a huge political problem during the war because you had all these soldiers. Once they'd driven the Nazis out of Soviet territory, and they go into Eastern Europe and then into Central Europe, and they see the most devastated, ransacked part of Poland is infinitely more prosperous than the village they came from back home, and they realized we were lied to. The first reaction of Soviet soldiers when they went into Poland was that it's so rich. And when they went into Germany, they thought, God, it's so rich, what did they want our territory for? And so this was a real political crisis because all these soldiers came back and they were genuinely pissed off. On the one hand, they were very patriotic because they fought this war to defend the nation. But on the other hand, they were extremely aggrieved. And so you had another wave of repression in 1947, 48 to try to put the genie back in the bottle, to bring the population back under control. So, Vasily Grossman has it brilliantly when he talks about the hypocrisy of the system where people were actually forced to utter these incantations about stuff they knew patently to be false. It's just grotesque in a way. Women's rights and changes in perception. Again, this is a complicated question, but it's a really good question, and it's a really important issue because, on the one hand, women's rights were expanded enormously in the 1920s under the Bolsheviks, and then those rights are somewhat constrained to the extent that all of society's rights are constrained and restricted in the 1930s. Women enter employment, and technically on paper, they have the same rights as men. But as I've said, they become marginalized into really less favorable industries and trades and occupations. In 1936, and this is a big issue, abortion is banned. This was a huge rollback. There's a huge campaign to strengthen the family because the family is seen as the sort of nucleus of imposing discipline. Strong families will discipline their children who will then be loyal to the state. So you have a big shift in propaganda and in education regarding family policy to this extent. On the other hand, and then you have this cult of motherhood. Women were given awards for having lots and lots of children. And to that extent, the sort of sexual division of labor becomes very regressive. And this becomes part of the model that exists almost through the entire Soviet period. And more important, the traditional family is this. The man's the boss, and the man drinks. The woman does all the housework, the man does nothing. Brings home a wage pack, but the woman also works. So the double burden, if you want a brilliant example of the double burden, you want to look at a typical Soviet family. They did spend a lot of time, sociologists sort of delved into this problem in great depth in the 1960s. They did all these phenomenal family household time budget surveys. And they document, who did what in the household. Men did bugger all. Women even prepared the furniture. Women grew the vegetables. A lot of families had a plot, an allotment, to supplement the inadequate food supplies that came from the state. The women did most of the work there. There was this amazing statistic I came across when I was looking at this for the 1960s. A woman single parent did virtually the same amount of housework as an unmarried woman without a child. As soon as she got married, her domestic labor burden doubled. So acquiring a husband was worse than acquiring a child in terms of the amount of housework you had to do. So the Soviet family becomes extremely traditional, and this is a problem in Russia today. You talk to people, and these attitudes still persist. On the other hand, women are relied on to hold the fabric of the society together. The man drinks, the woman is the rock of stability. People liked hiring women to a certain extent because women didn't drink and they didn't go absent and they were better disciplined on the shop floor. But also people took advantage of that and they didn't pay them very well. Women's motivation for working was different from that of men. Men worked to get an income or for pride if they were skilled and pride in their trade. Women worked because they wanted the sociability of getting out of the house and having other people to talk to at work. Which also meant that they were that was a factor that compensated for their low wages and lousy jobs. Basically, the Soviet family model, I think, was essentially regressive, despite the economic gains that women were able to make within the system.
I think I've got the man here in the blue shirt there, and then you. If anyone's got any more questions, can you just wave so I can get your name down or get your jumper down? Jumper. Cool. Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, we talked about the ideological sort of support for industrialisation and the mass influx of workers into the cities.
Can you speak up a bit?
Sorry, I wanted to ask about the role of foremen in negotiating between the workforce and managers, because I mean, from what I read, the foreman kind of did a lot of the, I mean it's a bad metaphor, but a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of negotiating those relationships, and it seems that even today, like the foremen are really kind of really important in like the Russian workplace. In terms of that relationship, actually, they're just kind of managing everything. I just wanted to ask what you knew about that. Sorry.
Foremen are key here, because it was up to foremen to organize jobs within a unit, to organize, they had these work teams called brigades. It was the foreman who made the concessions over norms or phony bonuses to compensate for lost wages. So the foreman was absolutely key here to that. To a lesser extent, the shop chief, the shop superintendent. But that's absolutely right what you say. I don't know what goes on in Russian industry today, because there's so little of it, and basically I decided to concentrate on history. But yes, all through the Soviet system, the foreman was the key negotiator. I mean, I knew a guy who was a foreman in an auto factory, and the way he operated, it was really revelatory. It's all these informal mechanisms. So in the late Soviet period, if you showed up drunk, labor law said you should be fired. Well, no one was going to fire a drunk, because by letting the drunk carry on working, you could get the drunk to do all kinds of jobs that your other guys wouldn't do. And if you had to negotiate with somebody, to get your plan fulfilled, it was the foreman that went to say, well, let's do a little overtime here, come in on Saturday, whatever, and do that. The foreman are absolutely key to this. Everything went through them.
Man there, and then
World War II, I mean, from what you're describing, the eve of World War II, you've got the combination of terror and a totally dysfunctional industrial system. Now, in order to turn the military situation around, the Soviet Union needed tens of thousands of tanks, airplanes, and so on. So it needed an industrial system which could deliver equipment which didn't fail, shells which weren't dud. And there was a new political motivation in the sense that the country was being invaded. There was a Great Patriotic War. People saw, the horror of the Nazis killing millions of people on the, on the western side of the Soviet Union. But in a sense, that political motivation is not enough. So what changed? I mean, 3 years was not a long period for the Soviet Union to be able to, to churn out the tanks and the airplanes necessary. So what happened?
That is a key question. First of all, and it goes back to the I was saying, did it fail? Did industrialization totally fail? No, there was a structure there. There were factories. They turned out stuff. And what they did during the war is they vastly simplified the profile of what they were producing, so they could concentrate on a relatively small number of items. And the main thing was motivation. It's the only, I think, having looked at the war in great detail, I think the war period is probably the only period from 1928 up until 1991 when the regime actually had the consent of its population. Didn't mean it had overwhelming, effusive popular support, but it had the consent of the population. And what people endured was almost unbelievable, the hardships. 11 to 16-hour working days, no days off. People were ill. Starvation, literally starvation rations. Hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation on the home front. Maybe millions, we don't know, but at least hundreds of thousands. People just put up with unbelievable hardships and deprivation to defeat the enemy. And also, I think it wasn't just the general population that was motivated. The people with lower levels and middle ranks of the state apparatus suddenly could use some of their position as training and organizing things. The positive side of their experience. They had a crisis. They may not have done it brilliantly, but they were able to organize a rationing system. They were able to organize housing, horrendous housing, but housing for all the evacuees that fled to the east and took up jobs in the east. They were able to organize rudiments of medical care for people. It wasn't very good, but they could do that. They could organize transport when transport wasn't available and when there wasn't any fuel. So all these, and the other thing about the war is that a lot of decision making was no longer strictly coming out of the center. A lot of decision making was delegated down to localities. So people were able to use their creativity to solve problems. You saw that in the evacuation when they carted up all these factories onto freight cars and the rails and carted them to the east. They dismantled these factories, they shipped them. There was chaos, but people then put their minds to it and they sorted it out. And they managed to get a large proportion of the production capacity from Ukraine out into the Urals or into the Volga region where they could set up work and start producing stuff again. So it was a unique political and economic situation there, I think. And it wasn't repeated at any other time in Soviet history.
Okay, I have a question here and then a question here.
You mentioned, is it called a labour passport or a worker's passport?
A workbook.
Workbook.
Labour book.
Now, that as a method of social and political control was existed in France and Germany in the 19th century, and it was hated, and that's why it was abolished. In Soviet conditions, was the labour book important generally as a method of control, and was it hated by the workers?
It was indeed.
And how was it justified by a regime that claimed to be a workers' state?
Same way everything else was justified by a regime that claimed to be a workers' state. They tried to introduce the labor book in 1932, and there was so much opposition to it that they withdrew the idea. They really finally introduced it definitively in December 1938. 3rd of December 1938. But you still had to have a document, and it's really interesting showing your past employment record. And if you look at court cases, there were a lot of workers in the 30s who went to court and claimed for unfair dismissal. It was illegal up until the workbook was introduced for an employer to put derogatory comments into your work documents. So a lot of workers actually successfully sued for what they called involuntary dismissal. The workbook was introduced in 1938, and that was a means of control when you had to produce it. And a lot of managers got into trouble when the restrictions came on workers illegally fleeing their factories for hiring workers without checking their workbook to see if they had been allowed to leave with permission or not. It was resented. But once the war started, people just got on with it.
Okay, question here.
The old joke is that the failures of Soviet industrialization were the best argument for capitalism since Adam Smith. And you certainly provided lots of evidence that it was something of a disaster. But the great irony, if that's the word, is that capitalism, as we understand it, this world system, seems to be saved by a former Stalinist industrialized system, i.e. China. So, without the Chinese economy to keep the world economy going to 2008, things would be very different today. So in a sense, our world today, the legacy of Stalinist industrialization is all over the world. I just wondered, I appreciate this is a whole different area, but the total failure of Soviet industrialization and the apparent success, or at least in the sense that it led to the success of today's, whatever you want to call the regime in China, but whatever. Clearly the industry in China today is very different from the old Stalinist system, but it, to some extent, is based on that. So I just wondered what thoughts you had about that.
None. Interesting observation. I'll think about it.
Okay. Question here. If there's no one else who wants to do, okay, 1, 2, all right.
I lived in Russia for a couple of years, and I was struck by people of a certain age, usually women, because most of the men have been dead. Women who remembered the 30s, who were teenagers then or early 20s then. There is a great deal, I mean, they're called Stalin's grannies, it's a sort of derogatory word, but there's a great deal of kind of nostalgic looking back to that time. People were sort of not just the terror, which you said doesn't affect many working people, but yeah, just the actual industrial oppression on these people and the harsh conditions of life. I'm wondering, it goes back to the questions other people have asked us, how did they win over? They must have a certain level of support. They must have had a certain level where they bought people off or convinced people this was a good idea, other than sheer repression. And I'm sort of, whether I agree entirely with your analysis, but it's just, I'm puzzled eternally, quite apart from just nostalgia, as to where the Stalin's granny thing comes from. People look back on that time as a sort of a really good time in some senses, or that Stalin, we knew where we were with Stalin kind of thing, and that's a strange thing. Just a little, another big question attached to that. In terms of the elite at the top of your pyramid, how kind of sealed off from the rest of the population was the elite? Was there much movement in and out of it, upwards and downwards? Or was it really a kind of an elite which then inherited privileges from people, and was there like an encrusted elite? Or was it just kind of people could move up and down freely from it?
Can you take another question? Or do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, all right. Those are two really good ones. Go on.
Okay, do you have any question?
Mine was more a polemic. I think we shouldn't take away from this the idea that Soviet planning was a total failure, because I think that way we cannot understand the nature of blind planning, because I think it's not just the Second World War where you've got the MiGs, you've got Katyushas, you've got Soviet tanks, you've got a whole series of Kalashnikov, a whole series of technical developments that were carried out by this plan. But you also have the whole of the space industry, which for whole periods in the 50s and 60s was well ahead of the United States in terms of its rocketry, in terms of its weapon systems. And I know they had to concentrate enormous resources on this. But I think it would be a mistake to come away from this thinking that this blind planning system only produce useless goods, because one have to say the whole of Eastern Europe and Cuba and other countries actually developed parts of their economies on exports from the Soviet Union, and they might not have been very good exports, but they worked to some extent because they were lorries that worked, they were sort of very basic stuff that actually worked. And anyone who stayed in a Soviet hotel in -20, -30 knows that the heating systems and the double glazing and the glass was very effective, and it wasn't just a load of old crap. And I say this not as someone who's a fan of the Soviet system, just I think we should bend the stick a bit back away from the idea that it just produced junk, because an economy that just produced junk wouldn't have survived for as long as it did.
I think you need to distinguish planning from organization. You had a bureaucratic system that could organize stuff. It could organize some things. It could organize the general economy badly. It could organize certain priority sectors adequately. It could develop a space industry, but it couldn't produce washing machines. It couldn't produce refrigerators. You ever seen a Soviet washing machine?
Tragically, yes.
You know, the Soviet, this relates to the domestic burden on women.
Yeah.
Soviet washing machine. It was a twin tub machine. You filled it with water and a bit of soap, and you threw the clothes in. You did all this manually. By the way, up until the 50s, a lot of households didn't have running water inside. You had to get water from a street pump and drag it up in a bucket. So you take your bucket, you put it into the first tub, you turn the thing on, it will churn around, and then you have to empty it by hand. You then have to repeat this to rinse the clothes, and then to wring them, right? It takes enormous amount of labor power, physical, arduous, grueling work to wash clothes in an old Soviet washing machine. I've used them. So, yes, they could produce an ICBM that could obliterate New York, but they couldn't produce a washing machine. They couldn't produce refrigerators till the 1950s, not on a domestic basis, and they were produced by the automobile industry, not by the consumer goods industry. The distinction I'm making in planning, I think, is that you have to see is a political concept. It's almost an epistemological concept. There has to be a correlation between goal and result. And the correlation between goal and result is only achieved if the people actually creating the result are involved in setting the goals. In the Soviet Union, that was never the case. The people who set the goals were totally divorced politically from the people who had to implement them. And so they found all kinds of leakages and leverage and ways out to deviate from the instructions. And so the result wasn't nothing, but it was something that was a little bit defective. It wasn't necessarily always junk. It just didn't quite work the way it was supposed to work. And this was a huge break on innovation. Innovation itself was discouraged. What manager is going to innovate if it means disrupting established work patterns, if it means taking risks that you might not fulfill your plan? You're told to buy a piece of new, updated equipment. Well, the equipment might not work, and your indicators might collapse. And then you're out of a job. And so you replicate that across tens of thousands of production units in the country, and it doesn't innovate. And you get on and on and on and on and on. So you're right, it's a system that could organize production, but it couldn't really plan, as I say, in an epistemological sense, because there was no linkage between the goal setters and the goal implementers. And I think that's just a fundamental difference. The issue of nostalgia is a perpetual conundrum. First of all, a lot of people bought the deal. It was an exciting period if you weren't repressed and if you had enough to eat. A lot of people really thought they were building socialism, but a lot of the euphoria of the first 5-year plan was pretty much dissipated by the late 30s. After Stakhanovism and after the terror, etc., it was a very sober, very sad society in that sense. It's always a problem with people's memories, because if things are bad in the present, you always think there was a better time in the past. And most older people get very conservative. We all do. Hopefully not so conservative that we've become really conservative. Maybe not as old as I am. But I think if you lived in Russia, you meet a lot of older people, and they talk about the 30s, especially they talk about the war, because it was a dynamic period, and this was the highlights of their life, and everything became very grim after that. And the enthusiasm, there's nothing to be enthusiastic about. So that's always a difficult issue. And I think that there's also, in many cases, there's a huge gulf between what people think they remember and what they actually experienced. The issue of the elite is important because in the 1930s and 1940s, it was a dynamic process. There was genuine social mobility, because if you imagine the pyramid, with industrialization, the pyramid is, in a way, flattening out as peasants become workers and there's more technical specialists, and the number of technical jobs and workers' jobs expands, but this line here moves up. So you have this elite that, as I say, is almost exclusively proletarian in its background, and it's very fluid, partly because of the purges. People die and have to be replaced. Because of the war, people are killed and have to be replaced. But once you get to the 1960s, you have the emergence of an inherited class structure. In other words, once you get to the 1960s, the social group that you're born into determines where you will wind up. And by the 1970s and 1980s, mobility is slowed down almost to a halt. The main lever of perpetuating this, of reproducing this social structure becomes education, because there's no private property. You can't bequeath you don't own a factory. You can't bequeath shares to your progeny. But what you can do is you can use the combination of political connections and privileged access to education to ensure that your kids enter the intelligentsia or go even higher up. And that's the main mechanism for reproducing the social structure of the society. So much so that we actually have a serious crisis in the 1970s and 80s, where you've got the number of people with higher education or a higher technical education vastly exceeds the number of skilled jobs that require that amount of knowledge. And so you get a lot of people going into factory work, partly because the money's better, but partly because they got no alternative. And this leads to even further demoralization, which then causes political problems within the system, certainly by the 1980s. But it is a fluid system, but as I say, by the 70s and 80s, already it's emerging in the 60s, but certainly by the 70s and 80s, it's congealed, and you have a discernible inherited class structure.
Okay, so there's a question there.
I was just thinking about, like, ideologically, do you think that, like, the collapse of the Soviet Union, I haven't got much to do with the 5-year plan, do you think the collapse of the Soviet Union was a victory or failure for traditional socialism, and especially going back to the central planning? If, like, a core notion of traditional socialism is all about the workers having control over means of production, and, you know, the central planning of the Soviet Union, well, they never had control of production. I mean, like, even under Lenin, like, a lot of like cooperatives and the Soviets were shut down, what I was reading about. And then, especially under like Stalin, instead of a dictatorship of the proletariat, it was a dictatorship of the bureaucracy. I think Trotsky called it a degenerated workers' state. So you could argue that, like, central plan completely failed, especially ideologically. So do you think that, like, in that sense, when the Soviet Union did collapse, it was actually benefited all the other socialists around the world?
Could have, but it doesn't seem to have worked out that way. I thought at the time the same as you were just saying, that it would open up vast opportunities, but in fact, unfortunately it didn't. And one reason, I mean, for my naiveness.
That's just because they exploited the positive image of socialism. Like the two main propaganda states, like the USSR and the USA, both called the USSR socialist, but for different means. So, like, the Soviet leadership called themselves socialists for, like, to make themselves look good. So, like, oh, I'm socialist, I'm amazing and stuff. And then the Americans called it socialist to discredit the egalitarian, like, ideology that it was. So I think that's why, like, socialists are now sort of, like, horrible, like, evil and stuff like that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The disappointment came if you went to the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev period, and you saw for a brief period of enormous political dynamism. It didn't take very long for people to become highly politicized and to actually go out on the streets and argue and debate and to form alternative movements and groups. There was a short window of opportunity, but it didn't materialize for an alternative. Because basically it's a complicated story, but basically it collapsed due to enormous economic hardship because the economy collapsed. And workers were, instead of thinking about socialism, they thought about the market. They had these totally romanticized views of what the market would do. Oh, if we could get access to the market, we could sell our coal, and we could improve our coal mines and get better housing. You know, they didn't have any idea what a real market meant. They learned very quickly, but by then it was a bit late because the country became deindustrialized, and the workforce became sort of a bit like the workforce under Thatcher here, dissipated in deproletarianized in that sense.
Okay, unless there are any final questions. Okay. So one final thank you.